All right, get ready, everybody,
Yeah.
because we're going deep today.
Deep into what exactly?
Ancient civilizations and some of their more, well, let's just say interesting practices.
Interesting how.
You'll see. The sources you dug up are amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, some of this stuff, it's just wild. Like, forget juice cleanses. This is next level weird.
Well, you definitely got me curious.
Yeah, we're talking ancient beauty regimes, punishments. Some of it's pretty brutal, honestly.
Oh, wow. Okay, so like trigger warning them.
Yeah, probably a good idea. Just to be clear, though, we're just reporting what's in these sources. Not saying we endorse any of it.
Got it. Just laying out the facts. So where do we start?
Let's kick things off in ancient Egypt.
Ah, Egypt, pyramids, pharaohs, all that jazz.
Yeah, but it's way more than that. Like, did you know about that whole thing with the mummy bandages in the early 1900s?
Mummy bandages. Now that sounds intriguing.
Someone thought it was a good idea to, get this, recycle them as food wrapping paper.
As food wrapping paper? What?
Yeah, I know, right? Not their brightest idea.
Yeah.
It caused a massive cholera outbreak.
Oh, I see what you mean by interesting now.
Yeah, talk about unintended consequences. Guess they didn't really understand disease transmission back then like we do now.
Makes you appreciate modern medicine, huh?
Totally. But it's crazy, though. People back then were obsessed with ancient Egypt.
Obsessed. Like,
They were importing mummies, not just to study, but for entertainment.
wow, that's different.
And, get this, they even ground them up to use as medicine.
Ground up mummies. You're kidding, right?
Nope. Hard to believe, but true. I wouldn't want to try that smoothie. And then there's that whole thing about retainer sacrifice.
Retainer sacrifice. You mean like
Servants being buried alive with their masters.
buried alive to, what, serve them in the afterlife or something?
Exactly. It's wild, right? Like, from their perspective, I guess it wasn't murder. But still.
I'd take a hard pass on that job.
Right. Talk about bad employment contract.
Yeah.
And their justice system. I wouldn't want to end up in that courtroom either.
What was so bad about it?
They used beatings to get confessions, and oracles decided whether you were guilty or not.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's not exactly fair or impartial.
No kidding. It's like a really bad reality show, not a justice system.
So you're innocent until proven guilty
Hmm.
by beating. And oracles.
Okay.
Talk about potential for corruption.
Totally. Okay, enough about Egypt for now. Let's move on to ancient Rome.
Ancient Rome. Now, those guys were interesting.
Obsessed with social status. Like,
Hmm.
they actually had laws about what colors people could wear.
Yeah, they were big on that whole hierarchy thing. You know about sumptuary laws, right?
Refresh my memory.
Basically, rules about what you could wear based on your social standing. For example, if you were lower class, no purple for you.
Purple.
Yeah, purple was the color of royalty. That dye came from mollusks and was super expensive.
So basically, wearing purple was like driving a Ferrari today.
Yeah.
Showing off your wealth.
Exactly. But of course, people always try to bend the rules, right?
Always.
Hmm?
What happened?
Well, the funny thing is, noble women started copying the hairstyle prostitutes were forced to wear just because it was fashionable.
Oh, wow. So the fashion police backfired, huh?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. But hey, it's Rome. They had a rule for everything.
Even family matters.
Especially family matters. Did you know Roman fathers could actually sell their sons into slavery?
Seriously?
Yeah.
Their own sons?
Yep. And not just once, they could do it twice.
Wow, that's intense.
Right. The paterfamilias, the head of the household, he was the big boss. Total control over everyone. Wife, kids, slaves, the whole shebang.
So selling your son was just like a Tuesday afternoon for these guys to pay off gambling debts or something.
Basically, yeah. Or to punish them, teach them a lesson. It was a pretty messed up system. And don't even get me started on the punishments for actual crimes.
Hold on, what were the punishments like?
They had some brutal penalties. Like, if you killed your father.
Patricide.
Exactly. They'd sew you up in a sack with a bunch of wild animals and toss you in the Tiber River.
Seriously. That's hardcore. Makes you wonder what they'd think of our modern-day crimes.
Right. Imagine getting thrown in the river with a badger for illegal downloading.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
But speaking of clashing viewpoints,
Yeah.
get this. The Romans thought Christianity was a cannibalistic blood cult.
Really? How did they get that idea?
They totally misinterpreted the Eucharist. You know, the bread and wine representing Christ's body and blood.
Ah, I see. So a complete misinterpretation of a symbolic ritual.
Totally. Their worldview was so different. And speaking of blood,
Mm.
they believed gladiator body parts had, like, magical healing powers.
Gladiator body parts, like charms or something.
Well, not exactly charms. They used their blood and livers to treat epilepsy.
Gladiator blood for epilepsy. I don't know about that prescription.
Right. I'll stick to modern medicine. But get this. They also use gladiator sweat in face creams.
Hmm.
Wait for it, aphrodisiacs.
Gladiator sweat. Okay, no, that's just...
Gross, right? It's amazing what people used to think was normal.
Makes you wonder what people 1,000 years from now will think about our habits.
Ooh, good point. All right, let's move on from the gladiator arena and all that sweat. Let's talk about something a bit more fragrant.
Fragrant. Okay, you've piqued my
We're
interest.
ready for this? The Romans were really into urine.
Urine.
Yeah. They used it for laundry, tanning leather, and even, wait for it, taxed it.
Taxed urine. Seriously. Who thought of that one?
Emperor Vespasian, he was a
Yeah.
practical guy. He famously said, money doesn't stink.
I guess not, literally. But speaking of things that probably did stink, have you heard about the tersorium?
The what now?
The tersorium. It was a shared sponge on a stick.
A sheer sponge on a stick. What for? Don't tell me.
You guessed it. Cleaning up in those Roman public toilets.
Oh, yikes. Not exactly hygienic, even for the Romans.
Well, they did have pretty impressive sanitation systems for the time. Those public baths and sewers were a big deal. But yeah, those toilets. Not for the faint of heart, that's for sure.
Maybe we should move on from toilets for a bit. How about we switch gears and talk about the Mongols?
The Mongols. Okay, now those guys were a force to be reckoned with.
They built a huge empire, right? Across Asia and even into Europe.
Huge and powerful. They definitely left their mark on history.
Though maybe not always in a good way. Weren't they known for being pretty brutal?
Brutal is an understatement. They were ruthless conquerors responsible for millions of deaths.
It's crazy how much power they had.
Power and a total disregard for human life.
Makes you think about the cost of progress, right?
Definitely. Some empires are built on blood and bones. And speaking of empires with a dark side, how about the Aztecs?
Oh yeah, the Aztecs. Human sacrifice on a whole other level.
It's hard for us to wrap our heads around it today, but it was a central part of their religious beliefs. They believed they had to make these sacrifices to keep the universe in balance.
So they weren't just being randomly cruel.
No, it wasn't about cruelty. They believed that burning a victim's heart would nourish the gods and keep the world from descending into darkness.
I'm getting some serious mixed signals here.
How?
Well, they're burning hearts to keep the world from darkness. But then the warriors who were sacrificed would, like, fight alongside the sun god after they died.
That's right. And they believed they'd eventually come back to Earth as hummingbirds.
Hummingbirds. Seriously. Okay, now that's just bizarre.
Hey, every culture has its own beliefs, right?
I guess. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground already. Egypt, Rome, Mongols, Aztecs.
Quite a whirlwind tour of ancient history, and we're just getting started.
You're right. But before we move on, let's switch gears for a second. I want to talk about something a little more modern, something that's been making waves lately.
Yeah.
Have you heard about that Netflix series, Ancient Apocalypse?
Ancient Apocalypse. Oh, yeah. Graham Hancock and his theories about lost civilizations. That's been causing quite a stir.
For those who haven't seen it, Hancock's basic idea is that a super advanced civilization, which he thinks was Caucasian, taught our ancestors how to build all those incredible ancient monuments.
He points to sites like Gunung Padang in Indonesia as proof. But his interpretation of the data, let's just say a lot of archaeologists aren't buying it.
So, like, he's cherry-picking evidence to support his theory.
That's what his critics say. And he's not exactly shy about criticizing mainstream archaeology either.
Oh, really? So he thinks they're hiding the truth.
Pretty much. He portrays himself as an outsider, an investigative journalist who's uncovering secrets the establishment doesn't want us to know.
Conspiracy theories always make for good TV. But let's shift gears again, back to something a bit closer to home. Literally. You mentioned the Rhode Island accused vampire earlier, Mercy Brown, right?
Yes. A fascinating and tragic case.
It's like something straight out of a Gothic novel. So this young woman, Mercy, died of tuberculosis back in the 19th century, back when they didn't understand TB very well.
Exactly. It was a terrifying time with very few effective treatments.
So when her family started dying too, they got it in their heads that she was a vampire, preying on them from beyond the grave.
Desperate times call for desperate measures, I guess.
Desperate is right. They dug up her body, looking for proof of vampirism.
Did they find any fangs or glowing eyes?
Not exactly. But they did find some decomposed blood in her heart, and that was enough for them.
Enough for what?
They burned her heart and liver and gave the ashes to another sick person as a cure.
Oh, wow. So not only did they exhume her body, but they also...
Performed a ritualistic burning and used her remains as medicine. Pretty messed up, right?
It's a sobering reminder of how fear and superstition can take hold, especially when people are facing a crisis they don't understand.
Okay, we need a break from all this death and destruction. How about we talk about something a bit lighter?
Lighter, you say? All right, I'm game.
Okay, maybe not lighter exactly, but definitely more superficial. I was reading about the history of dentures, and, well,
Dentures. Don't tell me they used to carve them out of wood or something.
actually, it's even weirder than that.
Yeah.
Back in the day, dentures were often made from real teeth.
Real teeth. Whose teeth?
They called them Waterloo teeth.
Waterloo teeth. Okay, I've got a bad feeling about this.
You ready for this? They pulled teeth from the dead soldiers after the Battle of Waterloo.
You're kidding.
Nope. Crazy, right? Like battlefield dentistry or something?
I guess when you need teeth, but why Waterloo specifically?
Well, Waterloo was a huge battle, tons of casualties, and the soldiers were young, healthy, their teeth were in good shape.
So essentially a dentist's gold mine. Grim, but resourceful, I guess.
Yeah, definitely resourceful.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what other things from our time will seem completely bizarre to future generations.
Right. Imagine someone in the future trying to explain a smartphone.
Exactly. They'd probably think it was some kind of sorcery. But hey, that's history for you.
Full of surprises. And speaking of surprises,
What's that?
well, we've only scratched the surface of bizarre ancient practices. There's a whole lot more where that came from.
All right, then. Lay it on me. What else have you got?
I could tell you stories that would curl your hair. But honestly, the thing that really gets me is that whole thing about using human remains in medicine.
Yeah, that was pretty messed up. Gladiator blood, crushed mummy. It's like something out of a horror movie.
I know, right? But it makes sense when you think about it. They didn't have our understanding of anatomy or disease.
I guess so. But still, it's pretty hard to swallow, literally. And those Waterloo teeth. Luxury dentures made from dead soldiers.
It's a wild thought, isn't it? Imagine what they'd think of our modern dental implants.
They'd probably think we were doing some kind of dark magic.
Speaking of things that might seem like magic to people in the past, let's go back to ancient apocalypse for a minute.
Okay, lost civilizations, ancient astronauts, all that stuff. It's definitely entertaining.
It is, but is there any chance Hancock's onto something? Or is it all just, speculation?
It's a tricky one. I mean, his ideas are definitely controversial. A lot of archaeologists think he's way off base. But on the other hand, he does raise some interesting questions.
Like, what if there are undiscovered archaeological sites out there? What if we've been misinterpreting the evidence all along?
It's kind of like those Roman beliefs about Christianity. Total misinterpretation. Right?
Exactly. We see things through our own cultural lens. But yeah, Hancock's theories, they're definitely thought-provoking, even if they're not always scientifically rigorous.
So take it with a grain of salt.
A big one.
Yeah.
But that goes for everything, really, not just Hancock. We should always be critical of the information we consume, no matter where it comes from.
Good advice. Okay, let's move on from lost civilizations and talk about something a bit closer to home, or at least closer in time. Remember Mercy Brown, the Rhode Island accused vampire?
Oh, yeah, her story's fascinating. A real-life vampire hunt in 19th century New England.
It seems so crazy. But you said earlier that vampire myths weren't just limited to Europe. Was that whole vampire hysteria thing happening elsewhere too?
Absolutely. It was a global phenomenon. In Europe, it was huge during the Middle Ages and even into the 18th century.
Wow. What was driving that fear? Were people just like super superstitious back then?
Well, superstition played a part for sure, but there were real-world factors at play too.
Like what?
Disease, especially outbreaks like the plague. People didn't understand how diseases spread, so they looked for supernatural explanations.
Makes sense. They didn't have germ theory back then.
Right. So the vampire myth provided a convenient, albeit terrifying, scapegoat for all those unexplained deaths.
So basically, a lack of scientific knowledge fueled those fears.
To a large extent, yes, and it wasn't just in Europe. Beliefs in vampire-like creatures pop up in cultures all over the world. China, Africa, the Americas.
Really? It's like a universal fear or something.
That does seem that way, doesn't it? It speaks to our deep-seated need to explain the unknown, to make sense of the world around us.
I guess even if those explanations involve blood-sucking monsters. But why vampires specifically? Why not werewolves or zombies? What is it about vampires that creeps us out so much?
Well, I think vampires tap into something primal, a fear of betrayal, of the familiar turning into something sinister. Unlike zombies or werewolves, who are usually just mindless monsters, vampires are intelligent, seductive, often beautiful. They blend in with society. They lure you in.
It's like that saying, beware of Greeks bearing gifts,
Exactly. You never know who might be hiding a dark secret.
or who might be secretly sucking your blood at night.
Right. And the thing is, vampire stories often reflect the anxieties of the time they were written in. Like in the Victorian era, with all its repression and sexual taboos, vampires became symbols of forbidden desires and dangerous temptations.
So basically, they were like a cultural mirror reflecting the fears and desires of the people who created them.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder what our fascination with zombies says about us today. Are we projecting our anxieties about pandemics and societal collapse onto these fictional monsters?
Good question. Maybe we're all just a little bit morbidly curious.
Yeah.
But let's move on from the undead and get back to those ancient practices. What else did you find in your research that really stood out to you?
Well, one thing that kept coming up, and I find it both fascinating and unsettling, is the use of human remains in medicine. We've talked about the gladiators and the mummies, but it was way more widespread than that.
Really? So it wasn't just a weird Roman or Egyptian thing?
Nope. It seems like people all over the world throughout history have used human body parts for medicinal purposes.
I know they didn't have our modern understanding of medicine, but still,
Mm.
the idea of eating human remains, it's just so gross.
I know, it's definitely not for the faint of heart. But remember, for them, it was legitimate medicine. They believed in the idea of, like, pure as like.
Wait, so if you had a headache, you might eat a piece of skull.
That was the logic, yes. And it wasn't just for physical ailments either. They believed that consuming certain body parts could give you the qualities of the deceased.
So eat a warrior's heart to become brave.
Exactly. It's a strange concept, but it shows you how powerful beliefs can be.
It's wild how long these beliefs persisted. Even in the 17th century, people were still drinking blood and eating powdered skull.
It does seem like a step backwards, doesn't it? But remember, these were times of great uncertainty. People were desperate for cures, for explanations.
I guess when you're facing the Black Death, you'll try anything.
Exactly. And without a scientific understanding of disease, it's easy to see how these practices took hold.
It's like those ancient Egyptians using crocodile dung for birth control. It might seem crazy to us now, but hey, who knows? Maybe they were onto something.
Maybe, or maybe not. But it's a good reminder that what we consider common sense today is often the result of centuries of scientific progress. Our ancestors didn't have that luxury.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? We like to think we're so advanced, but who knows what future generations will think of our practices.
Right. Maybe they'll be horrified by our obsession with processed food or social media.
They'll probably think we were all crazy.
Probably. But hey, that's the beauty of history, isn't it? It's all about perspective.
Well said. So, after all this talk about bizarre ancient practices, what are your main takeaways? What really stands out to you?
That's a good question. It's been a wild ride, that's for sure. I think the thing that strikes me the most is the power of belief, you know?
Yeah.
How these beliefs, even the ones that seem totally bonkers to us now, shaped the course of history.
Yeah, it makes you think. Like, what if the Romans had understood Christianity better? Would the whole Roman Empire have gone Christian? Would the world be completely different today?
It's crazy to think about, right? Like a little misinterpretation here, a different belief there, and suddenly the whole world changes. It's kind of mind-blowing.
Totally.
Hmm.
But speaking of things that are hard to wrap our heads around, what about those ancient practices that are, like, totally morally wrong by today's standards? Human sacrifice, using dead bodies for medicine. How do we even begin to understand that?
It's tough, right? It's easy to judge based on our values, but we have to remember morality isn't fixed. It changes over time.
So, like, what was considered normal back then is totally taboo now.
Exactly. We can acknowledge that some of these practices were brutal, even horrific, but we also have to try to see them through the lens of the time.
So, like, those Aztecs who did human sacrifices, they really believed it was necessary to keep the universe in balance.
They did. Doesn't make it right, of course, but it helps us understand their worldview. They were operating under a completely different set of assumptions.
It's like that saying, don't judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree.
Exactly. We have to be careful not to impose our modern values on the past. It's about understanding, not judging.
Okay, I get it. It's all about context. But can we talk about those dentures made from real teeth again?
The Waterloo teeth. What about them?
It's just so weird, you know, like this desire for beauty and vanity, but then using dead people's teeth to achieve it.
It's definitely a strange juxtaposition. But again, you have to remember, they didn't have the materials we have today. Human teeth were the best option they had.
I guess so. And hey, at least it wasn't as gross as those shared toilet sponges in ancient Rome.
Oh, yeah, the tersorium. Can you imagine?
No way. Talk about a breeding ground for germs.
But you said earlier that the Romans actually had pretty good sanitation systems overall.
They did. Those public baths and sewers were quite advanced for their time. It just goes to show that progress isn't always linear.
So even though they were sharing toilet sponges, they were still ahead of the curve in other ways.
Exactly. It's a good reminder not to stereotype entire civilizations based on a few isolated practices. There's always more to the story.
Totally. It's all about nuance, right?
Nuance and context. And I think that's a key takeaway from this whole deep dive. We've explored a lot of weird and wild stuff, but through it all, we've seen that human beings are complex.
We're capable of incredible things, but also some pretty messed up stuff. Exactly. And often it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. But that's what makes history so fascinating, right?
Totally. It's a constant reminder that we're all just trying to figure things out to make sense of the world. Even if that means using crocodile dung for birth control or wearing dead people's teeth,
Hey, whatever works, right?
I guess. So what's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with today? What should they take away from all this?
That's a good question. I think I'd say this. Approach the past with curiosity and humility. Try to understand the people who came before us, even if their practices seem strange or even wrong to us now, because ultimately we're all part of this big, messy, complicated human story.
That's a great point. It's a reminder to be both critical and compassionate.
Exactly. And maybe even a little bit humble, knowing that future generations will probably be judging our practices someday.
Ooh, scary thought. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. Thanks for taking us on this wild ride through ancient history.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
Until next time.